Literature Festival. I'm delighted to have two of the most prominent non-fiction authors with us here today, Mr. Khalid Ahmed. And I'm very proud to say that he is an Oxford author. We've just published two of his books, Sectarianism in Pakistan and Word for Words. And these books are available outside, so this is a good chance for you to have them signed. Khalid is the former, he needs no introduction, but he's the former editor of the Friday Times, and now he's with South Asia
Free Media Association.
SAFMA, South Asia Free Media Association. And very pleased to introduce Mr. Ahmed Rashid. Also, he also needs no introduction, but Ahmed is the author of a book on the Taliban, which flew off the shelves after 9/11. But I'm also proud to say that we have published your book also, Islam in Central Asia. So Ahmed too is an Oxford author. And of course, Descent into Chaos is his last book. And I hope you'll tell us about what you're working on now. So thank you, and over to you, Khalid.
Yeah. As a sit-down journalist, I've always admired Ahmed Rashid for going out and writing his books after witnessing events and being at places where there were crises. But he's not the barefoot journalist who doesn't really care for what the academics do. His books constantly challenge academic writers as well. As an academic writer, I admire him for giving me first-hand information about the themes that he embarks upon. What has happened? He's written 4 books, by our standards, all of them bestsellers. And that includes the shocking first book, which became an international bestseller, The Taliban. What characterizes his writing and puts off many people is that he constantly challenges the national narrative. A very effective critique of American policy in Afghanistan. If you read that book, you'll marvel at the depth at which he criticizes the world as the world goes into Afghanistan to set things right. What puts off the Taliban, he went ahead and apologized to the Afghan people for what we had done. Last time, when our official delegation was in the European Union, one of our journalists who had not read, I want him to first address the question of the Taliban themselves and the conduct of Pakistan vis-a-vis the Taliban and how it has affected the nature of the state in Pakistan. Then I'll follow up as he allows me to ask other questions.
Well, Amina, Khalid, thank you very much. It's a very, very great pleasure to be here. To be frank, I'm not often invited to audiences in Pakistan or to speak in Pakistan. I was barred from the Staff College. I was banned from the NDU. I've been banned from most places from speaking by the military, by the political government of the day, by President Musharraf. So it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I just got re-entry into the Staff College in Lahore, and I made a big public hoo-ha about it. I made a big public hoo-ha about it, saying that, well, there's a very a modern-looking, forward-looking bureaucrat who's now heading the Staff College. And I said, thank you very much for inviting me back after 5 years of being chopped out. Anyway, Khalid, to answer that question, look, there is a narrative to which the Pakistani people have been fed for the last 11 years, since 9/11, that everything that is happening here and the collapse of Pakistan, the fundamentalism, Taliban, is all the fault of America. If only the Americans would leave Afghanistan, the war would come to an end and Pakistan would be at peace again. The Pakistani Taliban would go back home and they'd go back to bed, and we would not be troubled by anything whatsoever. Now, my narrative has been very different from that. What I've been trying to write about and what I've analyzed and seen with my own eyes is basically the following. Yes, 25% of the cause of all this that is going on in Pakistan is the fault of the American mistakes, especially during the Bush era and even now, the Americans in Afghanistan. But what have we done since 9/11? We welcomed back the Afghan Taliban into Pakistan. We allowed them to settle here. We helped them relaunch the insurgency in 2003. The ISI was funding and arming and allowing them to set up training camps in Qila Saifullah, in Pashin, in Chaman, in Quetta, and in Fata. They were given Pakistani passports so they could travel around the Gulf and raise money for themselves. They were facilitated in every conceivable way by the ISI, the Pakistani military, by Musharraf, in order to relaunch themselves. Now, and they did that with enormous ferocity. But the main point I want to say is, and this is a big difference from the 80s, look, in the 80s we also funded the Afghan Mujahideen, or the CIA did. They were all living here. There were 5 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. There was an enormous passage of arms and money across FATA and across the border into Afghanistan. But did that lead to the radicalization of millions of Pakistanis? Did that lead to the creation of the Pakistani Taliban at that time? No, it didn't. Because these guys were either, these Afghans were either living in refugee camps or they were living inside Afghanistan. Now what happened after 9/11? We allowed these Afghan Pashtuns to come and live with our Pashtuns. We allowed Al-Qaeda to come and live with our Afghan Pashtuns, with our Pakistani Pashtuns. Now obviously over a process of 10 years, where there has been again a mobilization of jihad against the Americans, a lot of Pakistanis were ideologized and mobilized. So what we have seen is a very much a local phenomenon where first the Pashtuns of FATA and then other Pashtuns and then later Punjabi groups who've been fighting in Kashmir and in other places have all been radicalized by the presence of these Afghan Taliban. They've been recruiting Pakistanis. Thousands of Pakistanis have gone and fought in Afghanistan. And only in the last 4 or 5 years what we've seen is the creation of the so-called Pakistani Taliban. And these Pakistani Taliban are saying, fine, we are going to go kill Americans in Afghanistan, but we are also going to come back and attack the Pakistan army, and we are going to set up a caliphate here and a Sharia state, and we are going to overthrow the existing system. So the Pakistani Taliban is a homegrown phenomenon. This is not a phenomenon that has been created by the Indians or the Israelis or by the Americans. This is something that we have to blame for ourselves. And if we have to face up to it, we have to face up to it ourselves. You know, certainly they have now been aggravated. We have allowed the Americans to use drone missiles in FATA. Now, this was an agreement that was cut by Musharraf. It was not an agreement, you know, they're not lobbing these drones into Pakistan, you know, without our permission. They're doing it with our permission. And the case of Ray Davis in Lahore, which just happened, points you to it. There are hundreds of Americans running around here with all sorts of, you know, whether they belong to the CIA or whether they belong to these agencies or these contracting companies. We don't even know who they are. But obviously they were given visas. They were allowed to come here. Somebody has sanctioned this. So let's not be so innocent that somehow we are the victims of this great Zionist, India, American kind of plot. Let's first look at the mistakes that we are making. That's all my books attempt to do. That why can't Pakistanis be self-critical? Why can't we ever look at ourselves first and see the mistakes and try and rectify them? The fact is that we have made, in my opinion, far more mistakes towards the creation of the Pakistani Taliban and the creation of these extremist groups. Then, not to talk about, you know, the collapse of state institutions like the police and the judiciary. The justice system now cannot prosecute anyone for terrorism because it's not capable of doing it. The judges are too scared. The lawyers are too scared to do it. Nobody is prepared to prosecute the killer of Salman Taseer. So, you know, how, you know, when we are faced with such an enormous crisis, I think it is arrogant, it is misinforming the public, it is not allowing us to have a national narrative of correction and if you like, reconciliation with our own mistakes so we can rectify them and not move on and not just continue them.
Yeah. There is another author in our midst, Zahid Hussain. In his last book, he wrote that General Safdar, who was actually dealing with Baitullah Masood from Peshawar as Corps Commander, later on, he's described as one of the generals who made great concessions for the Taliban, the policy that Ahmed Rashid has pointed to. Later on, he met him in the ISI officer. He was second in command. And when Zahid Hussain told him that the Americans are not going to succeed in Afghanistan, he got up and said, "But that is what we want." So my next question is, people say that we went into Afghanistan in search of strategic depth, which was against India. Is this war that we say is not our war against India? And how much do you think we can achieve self-correction by normalizing relations with India?
Look, I think the first thing is we have to recognize that we are an extremely important player in Afghanistan. We have the longest border, the biggest trade. We provide a landlocked country, its major port, etc., etc. Not to speak of the Pashtun connection and all the rest of it. So, I mean that is a given. But at the same time, this is a landlocked country with 7 neighbors. All the neighbors have played devastatingly negative roles in Afghanistan. In the 90s, all the neighbors backed various powers. We backed the Taliban, the other neighbors backed the Northern Alliance. So, you know, there is an awful history of interference in Afghanistan of which the Afghans themselves are terrified. They're terrified of us, they're terrified of the Iranians, they're terrified of the Central Asians and the Russians now, and the Arabs who are distant neighbors. So unfortunately, this is, you know, something that the Afghans are having to cope with. Now, you know, the problem I find with the present policy because the policy is being run by General Kiani and the military, is that there is a policy which is basically saying that we are all important. Number one, if you want to talk to the Taliban, we are holding all the Taliban leadership. It's all living in Pakistan. So if you want to talk to the Taliban, you have to come through Islamabad, number one. Which is true, of course, it's a fact. But it depends, you know, how you're going to present this to the outside world, whether it's the Afghans, to Karzai, or whether it's to the Americans, or to the Indians. The second part is that we have national interests in Afghanistan, which are absolutely vital, there's no question. We need peace on that Pashtun side of the border, just as we need peace on this side of the border, where we've lost our peace on this side of the border completely. And the Americans have managed to lose the peace on that side of the border. But we need a Pashtun reconciliation of a character. We need recognition of the Durand line. Okay? But the other thing is that we also need to live with the neighbors of Afghanistan. No neighbor is going to allow Pakistan back in its 90s role or its 80s role as the sole arbiter of what happens in Afghanistan. Neither the Indians, who've given 1.3 billion in aid to Afghanistan, and have had stakes there which go back, you know, to partition, pre-partition, and post-partition. Nor the Iranians, who have just created an enormous padda with Hamid Karzai by blocking oil supplies to Afghanistan. Partly that was, you know, to get him to focus on Iranian interests and to tell him don't just look to Islamabad, you better look to Tehran as well. You've had very strong statements from Russia, from the Central Asian states. In other words, nobody is going to allow Pakistan alone to determine who befriends Afghanistan and who doesn't. What is needed is a national, international consensus in the region. Now, best of all, I would hate to ask the Americans to come and do this. Why don't we do this ourselves? Can't Pakistan, India, and these countries come together and say, look, we want peace in Afghanistan, that is all our basic aim. And we have to somehow have greater transparency over our influence and what we're all doing in Afghanistan. Most importantly, this kind of transparency negotiation is needed between India and Pakistan. In my opinion, the real bone of contention at the moment, where the battle between the two, the proxy war between the two countries is going on, is not Kashmir, and it's not anywhere else in India, it is in Afghanistan. India is not going to allow a Pakistani dictated peace through the UN or through NATO or through the Americans. It will be a spoiler to that. The Iranians, and there are many ways the Indians can spoil it, which have nothing to do with Afghanistan. They can arm the Baloch, they can arm the Sindhis, they can arm all sorts of different people here. They can create mayhem. So can the Iranians. We know that. There's a sectarian war going on in this country, which has obviously been backed by outside powers also. So we need a sensible diplomatic strategy, which actually tells the Indians, look, we are prepared to discuss Afghanistan separate from Kashmir. separate from Mumbai and all the other issues. Let's have a discussion on, you tell us what your problems are, or what you accuse us. We'll tell you what we accuse you. We'll tell you how many consulates we think you've got, how many RAW agents are operating in those consulates. You tell us how many ISI agents are operating in our consulate. Let's try and work out some transparency agreement. Now, there is a precedent to this. Every year, on January the 1st, both countries give each other lists of their nuclear installations. This has been an incredible means to keep, a way to keep the peace in the region. So that, you don't, if there's an attack or a war, or God forbid some kind of sabotage, you don't go and bomb the wrong place. So what I'm just trying to say is I don't think it would be difficult to create a transparency regimen between the two countries, which could then be extended further to the region. If we want to go it alone, and somehow say, oh, well, we are holding all the cards, the Americans have to come to us, everybody has to come to us, everybody has to accept what we're saying. But I've spoken to the Taliban.
One of the early books he wrote was on Central Asia.